In Utero is Nirvana's third and last studio album. Their second album, Nevermind, had been an era-defining success, catapulting them into a stardom they never would have dreamed of just a few years earlier. With this came the pressure of living up to this enormous success, and the press scrutiny into the private life of Kurt in particular. Being seen as mainstream by the underground community didn't sit well with the band, so for their follow-up to Nevermind, they really wanted to make a concerted effort to return to the band's original ethos. Despite being initially happy with the sound of Nevermind, Kurt later said, "I'm embarrassed by it now. It's closer to a Motley Crue record than it is a punk record." I'm sure some of that was aimed at appeasing the criticism from the underground scene, but it was clear that he wanted a much more raw and honest sound for the next record. It was around July '92 that the band started to think about heading back in the studio, but circumstances, mainly the birth of Kurt and Courtney's daughter Frances Bean, postponed the record, with Geffen releasing the compilation album Incesticide instead. They did get round to recording demos with Jack Endino later on that year though, with Endino tipped to be in contention to be the album's producer. Further demo sessions also took place in Brazil at the beginning of '93. The band's eventual choice of producer for the album was Steve Albini, having produced two of Kurt's favourite albums at the time, the Pixies' Surfer Rosa and Pod by the Breeders. Albini was the ideal guy, and his technique of using natural ambience instead of artificial reverb was a critical aspect in making that choice. Just weeks before being approached by the band, Albini had said that Nirvana were REM with a fuzzbox and an unremarkable version of the Seattle sound. Despite this, he was keen to work with them, saying, "They're essentially the same sorts of people as all the small fry bands I deal with, at the mercy of their record company." After agreeing to work with them, Albini sent a letter to the band, which was unconventionally not a percentage of the record profits, as would have been the norm. Instead, he asked for a flat fee, in this case $100,000, which does seem a fair amount for a couple of weeks' work, but had he have taken a percentage, it would have easily have been 5 times that. His reasoning was that he was providing a service, much like a plumber. It's their record, so to take a percentage would be immoral and an insult to the artist. Recording got underway in February '93 at Pachyderm Studios in Minnesota. This remote studio was Albini's choice, as he'd worked there before and loved their top-notch equipment, including a Neve 8068 console and a great sounding room. It didn't hurt that it was also very remote and away from any distractions that would get in the way of recording. The band stayed on site, with Novoselic comparing the setting to a gulag, saying, "There was snow outside and we couldn't go anywhere, we just worked." That's not to say they didn't have fun amusing themselves though. One of the things they did was set light to things with alcohol used to clean tape heads. Albini said, "It's a very pure alcohol that burns off, so you can put it on your hand and set your hand on fire and like, oh look, I'm a human torch." You get bored with setting regular things on fire, and then you start setting other people on fire. Albini prank calling Evan Dando was another moment to alleviate the isolation. Pretending to be an associate of Madonna, he had Dando waiting over 5 minutes promising she was on her way, much to the amusement of the giggling band in the background.
This is John Simons. Can you hold the line for a minute? I'm going to put Madonna on.
Okay.
Can you hold the line?
Yeah, sure. Madonna's coming on my phone with me now. Hello.
Just hold the line.
I will.
Their typical daily schedule was based around a midday start, with breaks for lunch and dinner, before wrapping up around midnight. The main backing tracks were generally recorded all together as a band, with some songs like Very Ape and Tourette's seeing Dave Grohl placed in the kitchen to take advantage of the natural reverb. Albini employed many mics to capture the drums, including a pair of Lomo 19A9 tube condensers, which were later sold along with 2 other mics that were used on the session for Kurt's vocals. His choice of mics for the drums were not the most common, but it's likely this was the setup used. A crucial part of the sound is the offset delay of the room mics, generally between 15 and 30 milliseconds. This was done to make the room sound bigger, and you can really hear the effect on Serve the Servants as Grohl hits the sticks together for the counting.
Okay.
One of Kurt's main guitars for the album was not actually his. He used Albini's Velino aluminium guitar for most of the clean tone sounds on the album. A great example of this can be heard on the verses of Heart-Shaped Box. He had his Fender Competition Mustang and a Fender Jaguar on hand, but also his Mustang-style guitar made by Danny Farrington. which can be heard on All Apologies and Dumb. Kurt had recently acquired it personally from Farrington, who recalls the meeting. Courtney asked to Kurt, "Will you trash this guitar too?" And Kurt got a very stern, horrified look on his face and said, "No, this will be for recording. This is my dream guitar." The Univox Highflyer was also used on the album. His main amplifiers were a Fender Quad Reverb with Utah speakers, and according to Albini, at least one of these speakers was blown, and the power tubes were all messed up. He also had the Randall Commander RG120, and a bespoke parts amp made by guitar tech Ernie Bailey, known as Frankenstein. This consisted of the chassis of a Marshall JCM 800, a transformer found in a dumpster, and various other parts all put together to sound nothing like a Marshall, and more like a tube version of a Roland jazz chorus. To push the distorted tones, a Boss DS2 and Tech 21 Sands amp were used, the Memory Man was employed for its vibrato function, the EHX small clone chorus, an Electro Harmonix polychorus that belonged to Ernie Bailey. This was most famously used on the solo of Heart-Shaped Box, and an echo flanger. He also had a bespoke pedal made by Albini's friend called Pedal X. This was essentially a tremolo ring modulator with overdrive. Kurt was originally intending to use his stage amp when setting up to record. This consisted of a Mesa preamp into a solid-state power amp that he'd been using for some time. He quickly changed his mind though, upon hearing it clearly in the studio as opposed to a noisy stage. He was shocked as to how bad it sounded, quickly abandoning any idea of using it on the record. The amps were mic'd up with 3 microphones, with 2 close and 1 distance mic. These included the RCA BK5, a Bayer M130 and an RCA 74. The close mics would be angled at the centre of the speaker, with Albini using distance to alter the tone, rather than moving them from the centre of the cone. For most of the songs, Kurt's lyrics were finalised on the day of recording. For instance, one day he sent someone to the local store to buy something to calm his stomach reflux. These were the cherry-flavoured antacids mentioned in Pennyroyal Tea. He claimed that only half the songs were ready, the rest originated from messing around in the studio. Albini employed 3 mics to capture Kurt's vocals: the Sennheiser MD421, an Electro Voice PL20, and a Lomo 19A9, the same used for the drums. For the most part, the best single mic for the song was used, and in some cases, 2 mics were chosen, panned oppositely, creating an interesting spatial effect. An ambient mic was also used and was fed to an expander, which opened to be heard only on the loud parts. Novoselic played his Gibson Ripper into a Hiwatt 100 head, modded with KT90 tubes. Also, a 100-watt 1968 Marshall Plexi Super Lead, also modded. This was run through the GrooveTube speaker emulator, which emulates the response characteristics of old Celestion speakers. This then went to a 4x12 Marshall cab. Albini said this about recording bass amps: "It's the same basic idea as with electric guitars. I'll try to have a dark mic, like the Bayer or Electro Voice, and a bright mic like a Josephson C42 or the AKG 451. The idea being that if you balance the low frequency and high frequency microphones, you get a more accurate representation of what the cabinet actually sounds like. I normally run the low frequency microphones through a soft compressor at a ratio of 3 or 4 to 1, and it's not usually working more than 3 to 4 dB. I don't normally compress the brighter of the 2 microphones." When recording was finally finished, the mood was jubilant when they all listened to the playback. Everybody was really happy, Albini said. There was this really serious, really definite sense of accomplishment. I thought they did a great job. The mood changed a week later though, when Kurt called Albini to tell him that Nirvana's A&R man hated the album. He said, "It sounds like crap. There's way too much effect on the drums, and you can't hear the vocals." The band's management weren't impressed either. Nonetheless, Kurt was determined the album should be released as it was. "I know for a while, there was a reactionary element to our mindset," Novoselic recalls. "I felt like we shouldn't touch it as a point of principle. But that's not very rational. That stuff clouds your judgment," Albini said. The next thing that happened was that I got a call from a journalist in Chicago saying that Geffen's publicity department had gotten in touch with him and off the record had told him that the new Nirvana record was awful, that it was unlistenable, and basically it was all my fault. After a while, the band agreed that some songs needed remixing, with the vocals and bass being too low being one of the main gripes. Albini refused to make these changes, so the band needed to head elsewhere. After some reluctance to hand over the master tapes, he finally gave in after a call from Novoselic, which led to Scott Litt remixing the songs that were intended for singles, Heart-Shaped Box and All Apologies. The episode left Albini unpopular with the major record labels. and he faced problems finding work in the years that followed its release. The album was released on the 21st of September 1993, predictably going straight to number 1. Although not as successful as Nevermind, it was seen as a triumph and a sign of things to come from a band now in control of their own destiny. Of course, that wasn't to be, with Utero being their last studio album, leaving a massive sense of what might have been.